Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we slice through the noise and get straight to the fascinating core of complex topics. Today we're embarking on a truly mind-bending journey. Close your eyes for a moment and picture medieval England. What springs to mind? Perhaps rolling green hills, quaint villages, a simpler time, right? Maybe a romanticized ideal of self-sufficiency and rustic charm, a retreat from our hyper-connected world. Well, I'm here to tell you that idyllic picture is about to shatter into a million pieces. Our mission today is to systematically dismantle that comfortable illusion. We're going to transport a 21st century individual, that's you, if you will, directly into the muddy boots of a farmer in medieval England. And we're going to explore, using every shred of source material we've got, why survival would be, quite simply, impossible. We're talking about an overwhelming, almost comical mismatch between everything you know, everything you're accustomed to, and the brutal reality of their day-to-day existence. We've identified 4 core pillars of impossibility that we'll be exploring. The brutal realities of agriculture itself, the unforgiving, often capricious hand of nature, the pervasive and deadly diseases that lurked everywhere, and the oppressive societal structures that would constantly be working against you. So let's unpack this together.
Indeed. What truly defines this challenge is a profound mismatch between modern capabilities, our deeply ingrained expectations of convenience and control, and even our basic physical conditioning compared to what was required just to cling to life in the medieval world. It's not just about lacking Wi-Fi or modern plumbing, It's about lacking the very infrastructure, the very understanding of how the world works, and the sheer physical and mental toughness that medieval life demanded. Our sources paint a very stark picture of this immense, almost insurmountable gap.
So let's start where everything began and ended for them. The land itself and the sheer, unadulterated physical effort required just to put the barest amount of food on the table. We're accustomed to farming being this massive industrialized process, right? Enormous machines, GPS-guided tractors, climate-controlled everything. But medieval farming, that was a testament to raw human endurance. It relied on brute force, manual labor, and rudimentary technology in a way that would quite literally break most of us today. Imagine you, having spent your life in an office or a comfortable home, trying to move Earth like that, day in and day out, with what they had. Staggering thought.
It truly is astonishing when you consider it. The cornerstone, of course, was the plow, primarily constructed from wood, with only the essential working parts made of iron. While the heavy plow, which emerged around the 10th century, was a significant technological leap capable of turning over heavier, richer soils and increasing productivity, especially in Northern Europe. Its use was incredibly strenuous. Our sources indicate that while lighter soils might require a pair of oxen, heavy clay soils necessitated a massive team of 8 oxen pulling it.
8? Wow.
8 oxen. Now think about that from a personal perspective. The average peasant family typically owned only 1 or 2 oxen at most.
Right, so you couldn't even plow your own field alone.
Exactly. This immediately tells you that farming was a fundamentally communal endeavor, whether you liked it or not.
Yeah.
You had to pool resources, rely on your neighbors, just to get your basic plowing done. Oxen were preferred over horses, not just for their strength on heavy land, but because they were cheaper to feed and, well, in a desperate pinch, could ultimately be eaten as meat.
A grim kind of practicality. So, beyond the Herculean effort of plowing, what other aspects of daily farming were the most physically demanding, pushing them to their absolute limits? I'm imagining it wasn't just turning over soil. It sounds like every single aspect of their day was a full-body workout. Forget a gym membership. Their life was the gym, with literally 0 rest days.
Precisely. Spot on. Take the sickle. This curved, single-bladed tool, typically iron or steel with a wooden handle, was indispensable for harvesting grains. But it was highly labor-intensive, demanding considerable skill and a smooth, arcing motion to cut stalks efficiently and, crucially, close to the ground.
Hard on the back, I imagine.
Extremely. Then for larger fields or for mowing grass, they used the scythe, with its long curved blade attached to a handle. This was more efficient for extensive areas than the sickle, but still demanded skill to swing it in wide, sweeping arcs, like a ballet of pure physical exertion. Crucially, the scythe was vital for producing hay, which was the critical feed source for their animals during the long, cold winters.
No hay, no animals survived the winter.
Pretty much. Without enough hay, your livestock didn't survive, and your family's future was even more precarious. You'd be looking at starvation for your animals, and very likely for yourselves.
And the relentless battle against weeds. We see fields today perfectly manicured, often sprayed and managed. But back then, it sounds like it was a constant losing war against nature's relentless push.
It was. The hoe, a simple tool with a flat, broad blade on a long handle, was used for weeding and cultivating. It was essential for loosening soil, removing weeds, and aerating the ground, especially during early plant growth, to prevent weeds from outcompeting crops for vital nutrients and water. This tool, simple as it was, symbolized the constant manual struggle against nature's determination to reclaim the land.
Just endless weeding.
Endless. And then post-harvest, to even get to the food, there was the threshing flail, 2 sticks joined by a chain or leather strap, used to separate grain from chaff. This wasn't just physical. It required significant technique and endurance to repeatedly strike the grain without crushing it or scattering it everywhere. It was often performed communally, adding another layer of social obligation.
Right. Back to that communal pressure again.
So when you think about a typical day for a medieval farmer, it started at dawn, often as early as 3 a.m. in summer, and involved long, arduous hours of physical labor. This constant heavy toil, which also included essential tasks like laundry done by hand, butter churning, and chopping wood, directly led to chronic health issues like debilitating back pain, crippling arthritis, and frequent injuries from accidents.
Makes sense.
What's fascinating here is how the very tools that enabled survival also systematically wore down the body, making long-term health and thus long-term survival incredibly difficult. The energy input versus output was a constant battle. Estimates suggest heavy labor required 2,500 to maybe even 9,000 calories per day.
9,000, that's huge.
It's a huge number, yeah. But they perpetually struggled to replenish this adequately. To put that in perspective, we're talking about burning through the equivalent of multiple marathon runs every single day, fueled by what amounted to bread and gruel. It's like trying to power a modern city on a single candle, utterly unsustainable for anyone accustomed to even light manual labor today.
And even with all that backbreaking labor, it wasn't like they were swimming in food. Here's where it gets truly unsettling. They had something called the 3-field system, which sounds like an innovation, but even that had severe limitations.
The 3-field system, adopted between the 9th and 11th centuries, was indeed an innovation compared to the earlier 2-field system. It divided arable land into 3 large fields, one planted in autumn with winter wheat or rye, a second with spring crops like peas, lentils, or beans, which, being legumes, actually help replenish nitrogen in the soil.
Okay, so that's smart.
It was. And the 3rd field was left fallow, unplanted, and could be used for grazing animals, whose manure further fertilized the land. This system did increase productivity by allowing more land to be cultivated annually, a definite step forward.
But the bottom line, despite all this effort and cleverness, was still incredibly meager, right?
The bottom line is that despite these efforts, crop yields per acre were remarkably low. Our sources tell us they amounted to only about a fifth. 1/5 of what modern farmers achieve.
1/5.
Yeah, think about that. You're working exponentially harder with less efficient tools and getting only a tiny fraction of the output. This meant that a much larger area of land was needed just to produce enough food for survival. And that was before any taxes or rents were even factored in.
And the land itself was a constant challenge, wasn't it? Like a never-ending science experiment they were just trying to get right, with literally no control over the variables.
Absolutely. While medieval farmers understood the importance of maintaining soil fertility, they primarily relied on animal dung, marl, and sometimes even seaweed as fertilizers. Marl, for clarity, was a rich mix of clay and carbonated lime. They dig up from pits and painstakingly spread across fields to improve soil quality, a truly backbreaking task itself.
More backbreaking work.
Always. But manure was often in short supply, especially for smaller farmers who couldn't afford large numbers of animals, and the harvest itself was a high-stakes, terrifying gamble. If the wheat was too dry, the valuable grain would fall off the stalk. If it was too wet, it would rot, sometimes even before it could be brought in. Grains had to be carefully brought indoors and stored in urns and pots to protect them from moisture, particularly during heavy rain.
So much could go wrong.
Exactly. Beyond that, the continuous fight against weeds, pests, and diseases was largely manual and, for them, often a losing battle. Farmers had limited knowledge and almost no effective means of control. If we connect this to the bigger picture for a modern individual, survival wasn't just about individual skill, strength, or knowledge. Remember the communal plowing and threshing. For someone accustomed to modern self-sufficiency, property rights, and readily available market services, this forced communal obligation would be a massive, perhaps insurmountable, hurdle.
Yeah, I can see that. Total dependence.
You'd not only need to master the back-breaking physical tasks, but you'd also have to navigate incredibly complex, often informal social dynamics, obligations, and potential conflicts with your neighbors. Imagine being entirely dependent on the goodwill and cooperation of others for your most basic needs. A dispute could directly jeopardize your own family's harvest.
That's
The
terrifying.
lack of individual autonomy and the absolute necessity of relying on and being beholden to others for basic survival tasks would be a profound psychological challenge for someone from the 21st century. It means that medieval survival was inextricably linked to one's often forced integration into and reliance on a rigid, interdependent social and labor system.
So you're constantly fighting against the elements, against the weeds, against poor soil with incredibly inefficient tools, and then you have to share all the output or lose half of it to taxes. I'm already feeling exhausted just thinking about it. It just sounds like a recipe for perpetual exhaustion, never-ending hunger, and crushing despair.
It was. Those low crop yields directly translated to less food, which often led to chronic nutritional deficiencies. This inadequate nutrition, coupled with the relentless physical demands of farming, that 2,500 to 9,000 calories per day we mentioned, and the constant threat of disease, created a vicious self-reinforcing cycle.
Downward spiral.
Exactly. Farmers would continuously expend vast amounts of energy, but struggle to replenish it adequately or efficiently. For a modern person, even if initially physically fit, this constant energy deficit would quickly result in exhaustion, extreme susceptibility to illness, and critically, a pervasive sense of hopelessness, undermining any drive to continue the necessary labor for survival. The physical labor wasn't merely difficult, it was often unsustainable given the energy input versus output, making long-term survival precarious and a constant battle against physical and psychological depletion.
Moving beyond the daily grind and the struggles with the land, let's talk about the ultimate, unpredictable boss nature. Medieval farmers were completely at the mercy of the elements, and those elements were anything but predictable. We think of climate change as a modern problem, but they were literally living through dramatic shifts that reshaped their entire world. So what does this all mean for them? It means they were on a geological roller coaster, utterly at the mercy of the weather, with no ability to forecast or mitigate its effects.
They absolutely were. The Middle Ages witnessed a critical climatic transition, moving from what's known as the relatively warm medieval warm period into the colder Little Ice Age. This transition was characterized by declining temperatures and even advancing glaciers across Europe.
Wow, actual glaciers advancing?
Yes. And this period of shift was marked by severe droughts between 1302 and 1307 across Europe, which then immediately preceded a phase of extreme wet and cold weather in the 1310s. These dramatic climate shifts directly impacted agricultural productivity, causing unpredictable changes in crop yields, severe livestock health problems, and disastrous disruptions to the critical timing of seasonal farming events like planting and harvesting. Imagine your entire year's survival depending on a climate you couldn't possibly understand or predict.
We're talking about real, palpable consequences, not just a bad harvest here or there. The sources mention specific devastating events like the drought from 1304 to 1307 in Central Europe.
That drought was characterized by multiple hot, very dry summers, considered the most severe of the 13th and 14th centuries. It was attributed to strong, stable, high-pressure systems lingering over the region, essentially blocking out any rain.
Just stuck there.
Pretty much. Interestingly, these droughts also had secondary devastating effects, correlating with an increased risk of urban fires in densely constructed medieval cities, which of course completely lacked modern firefighting capabilities. You'd be struggling to grow food, and then your entire village might just burn down.
Double disaster. And then, almost immediately after, they got slammed with the Great Famine. This sounds less like a period of scarcity and more like an apocalyptic event that would just wipe out entire communities. What were the truly catastrophic, far-reaching consequences of this on medieval society, beyond just the immediate hunger?
It truly was a cataclysm. The Great Famine of 1315-1321 was triggered by an onslaught of unusually heavy rain and cool temperatures that began in the spring of 1315 and persisted through 1316. The incessant rains made it literally impossible to properly plow fields for planting. Hay couldn't cure, meaning there was no fodder for livestock.
Another feed crisis.
Exactly. Low-lying areas in England, such as Yorkshire and Nottingham, were severely flooded. This period is widely considered the largest pan-European famine of the past millennium, with full recovery not occurring until 1322. It was a prolonged, brutal assault.
And the effects were catastrophic, right? Not just hunger, but a complete breakdown of society, a spiraling descent into unimaginable desperation.
Absolutely. Widespread crop failures resulted from the grain's inability to ripen in the cool, wet conditions. Simultaneously, cattle disease caused a catastrophic decline in livestock numbers. with sheep and cattle populations plummeting by as much as 80%.
80%, that's almost everything.
Almost everything. Food prices skyrocketed. Wheat prices in Lorraine, for instance, surged by an astonishing 320%. Imagine waking up tomorrow and the loaf of bread you rely on for your family suddenly costs 3 times what it did yesterday, with no warning, no government relief, and no hope of it ever going back down. That's the sheer, instantaneous terror and financial ruin this meant for medieval families.
Unthinkable.
Salt, which was essential for preserving meat, became scarce, and its price soared due to the inability to evaporate brine in the wet weather. The severity was such that even King Edward II of England struggled to find bread for himself and his entourage in 1315.
Even the king couldn't get bread.
Even the king. Desperation led to extreme measures. Draft animals, essential for future farming, were slaughtered for food. Precious seed grain, the very foundation of next year's harvest, was consumed.
Eating the future, like you said.
Exactly. Eating your future to survive today. Children were abandoned, and elderly individuals voluntarily starved themselves to preserve what little food remained for the younger generation. Chroniclers of the time even reported incidents of cannibalism, highlighting the absolute extreme desperation to which people were driven.
Good heavens.
This famine severely weakened the population, leaving them incredibly vulnerable. And tragically, it was followed just a few years later by the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in history.
Softened up for the knockout blow.
In a way, yes. This raises an important question. How could anyone navigate this without any external support systems? Our sources clearly illustrate a devastating chain reaction initiated by environmental factors. Climate variability directly caused extreme weather events like droughts and floods. These, in turn, led to immediate crop failures and massive livestock deaths, which then resulted in severe food shortages and hyperinflation of food prices.
The domino effect.
Precisely. The economic hardship forced desperate and self-destructive measures, like consuming seed grain and slaughtering essential draft animals, further crippling future agricultural capacity. This weakened, malnourished population then became highly susceptible to widespread disease. This cascading series of failures, initiated by environmental factors, would be impossible for a modern person to navigate without any external support systems whatsoever. There were no national health policies or administrative machinery to manage widespread public health crises, and significant food reserves were exclusively held by the elite.
So no FEMA, no Red Cross.
Nothing remotely like it. This meant no large-scale government intervention, no robust supply chains, and no organized disaster relief. Even when a precipitation seesaw indicated that some regions might have had excess precipitation while others suffered drought, the medieval world simply lacked the infrastructure. The roads, the wagons, the complex logistics to move that food where it was needed.
Couldn't get it there even if it existed.
Correct. This meant localized starvation was an inevitability, not a preventable tragedy, a stark contrast to our global supply chains, however imperfect they may be. This extreme vulnerability to localized environmental shocks without any external support or advanced logistical capabilities would be an immediate death sentence for a modern individual accustomed to systemic safety nets. Medieval farming was not merely about daily toil. It was a constant high-stakes gamble against environmental collapse, with virtually no margin for error or recovery. The psychological toll of this constant precariousness would be immense.
So you've battled the land, you've battled the weather. Now you face the unseen, constant, horrifying enemy disease. For a modern individual, the medieval world wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a microbial minefield. We take for granted our understanding of germs, our vaccines, our antibiotics, our public health systems. They had none of that, and the consequences were dire.
That's a crucial point. Disease was an omnipresent and terrifying threat. Of course, the most famous and utterly devastating was the Black Death, caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium, transmitted by infected flea bites. This catastrophe decimated nearly half of Europe's population. Our sources say between a third to a half.
A third to a half. Unimaginable.
Manifesting as bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic forms. It was the single most devastating pandemic known, wiping out entire villages and changing the course of history.
But it wasn't just the big one, was it? Beyond the devastating plagues, what were the most common everyday illnesses that relentlessly assaulted the medieval population? How would these constant ailments impact their ability to simply survive? It sounds like they were just constantly, relentlessly ill from a whole litany of common illnesses we rarely see today or that we easily cure.
You've really hit on something there. Precisely. Beyond the plague, a long list of common illnesses plagued the population daily. We're talking about dysentery, cholera, typhoid fever, chickenpox, measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, leprosy, diphtheria, influenza, whooping cough, scabies, erysipelas, anthrax, trachoma, sweating sickness, and even psychological conditions like dancing mania, which itself was likely triggered by extreme stress and famine.
What a list.
It is. Scurvy, for instance, a widespread nutritional deficiency caused by a lack of vitamin C, led to symptoms like spongy gums, bleeding, and loosened teeth. Fresh fruits, the primary source of vitamin C, were simply unaffordable for the poor, making scurvy a common and debilitating issue.
So they just lived with bleeding gums and loose teeth.
Often, yes. What's truly fascinating here is not just the presence of disease, but the sheer variety and constant threat from so many different vectors. Foodborne and waterborne illnesses such as dysentery, typhoid fever, cholera, and general diarrhea were rampant, primarily due to contaminated water and bacteria-infected foods.
Bad water, bad food.
Constantly. They also faced things like ergotism, grimly known as St. Anthony's fire, which caused agonizing burning sensations, hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene, all from consuming rye poisoned by fungi.
From their bread.
From contaminated rye bread, yes. Skin diseases were incredibly common among peasants and townspeople due to poor hygiene, often caused by infestations of lice, bedbugs, fleas, and other insects living in their rough wool clothing, which was rarely changed.
Ugh, constantly itching.
Imagine. Many viral diseases spread rapidly through human-to-human interaction, including measles, smallpox, chickenpox, diphtheria, influenza, and whooping cough, causing widespread misery and death among children. And then there was leprosy, which was feared as highly contagious, spreading through nasal secretions, leading to the brutal isolation of sufferers in leprosaries. It was a constant biological assault from every direction.
And the conditions they lived in certainly didn't help, did they? The complete lack of basic modern amenities we take for granted would make hygiene an impossible challenge for anyone, no matter how clean they tried to be.
A major contributing factor to poor health was the general lack of running water. People had to manually fetch water from nearby wells or rivers for bathing, making it an arduous task, often performed only once a week, or even less, if at all.
Once a week, maybe?
Maybe. While hand washing, especially before and after meals, was a common etiquette, full immersion baths were a luxury, a rarity, and vermin were pervasive. Fleas and lice thrived in rarely changed straw bedding, providing an ideal breeding ground for infestations that would have made restful sleep almost impossible. Imagine the constant itching, the bites, the absolute discomfort.
I'm trying not to. And the waste management, or more accurately, the complete lack thereof by our standards.
Exactly. Chamber pots were used at night and then emptied into cesspits. In towns, the wealthy might have private privies draining into yards or cesspits, but poorer classes typically shared communal toilets or cesspits. These cesspits also served as general rubbish dumps and required regular, highly unpleasant emptying by specialized laborers.
Someone had to empty the cesspit.
Yes, a grim job. Animal and human waste was commonly thrown into the streets of busy, unhygienic villages. Without toilet paper, people had to improvise with hay, grass, straw, or moss, hardly effective. The poor quality of drinking water, often laden with parasites and diseases, significantly contributed to health problems.
So drinking water was a risk in itself.
A huge risk. And poor food preparation and storage practices with no refrigeration were also major health risks. This raises an important question. Even if a modern person tried to be clean, how could they possibly escape exposure when their entire environment was saturated with pathogens? The fundamental lack of understanding of germ theory persisted until the 17th century. People literally believed parasites and germs spontaneously arose from dirt.
They thought dirt created germs.
Essentially, yes. Even well-intentioned hygiene efforts were futile against these systemic, invisible conditions.
So you're constantly ill, surrounded by filth, and when you finally do get really sick, what's the treatment? Some herbs and a prayer, no modern medicine, no hospitals, nothing we'd recognize as healthcare.
That's precisely it. Medical knowledge was extremely limited. Treatments often relied on rudimentary herbal remedies, bloodletting, often unsterile, and religious rituals. There was no significant advancement in medicine during the medieval period. Most diseases were cured using herbs and plants, not actual medical breakthroughs.
So, cured in quotation marks.
Definitely. The primary method of disease control was isolation of known or suspected cases and those who had been in contact with them, with quarantine periods gradually increasing to 40 days for plague. Crucially, no national health policies existed. Public health issues were managed on a fragmented, local community basis, which meant they were rarely effective on a larger scale.
Managed locally, meaning barely managed at all on a large scale.
Pretty much. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it wasn't a single deadly disease that was the problem. It was the relentless cumulative assault on the body. An individual would face chronic fatigue from unceasing labor, compounded by nutritional deficiencies, and be subjected to repeated exposure to multiple infectious diseases. Each illness, even if not immediately fatal, would weaken the body, making the individual more susceptible to the next infection, creating a vicious cycle of debilitation.
Just getting weaker and weaker.
Exactly. The body would exist in a perpetual state of stress and recovery, with no effective medical intervention to break this cycle. This constant cumulative burden, rather than isolated health crises, would systematically erode an individual's health, leading to eventual collapse and early death. Life was a continuous, exhausting battle against physical depletion and microbial threats, with no respite or effective treatment, leading to an extremely high probability of premature mortality and a constant crushing psychological burden.
Okay, so you're exhausted, perpetually hungry, and constantly battling invisible diseases. But wait, there's more. Now we add the oppressive societal structures. You weren't just a free agent farming your own land, master of your own destiny. You were part of a rigid, hierarchical system called feudalism. From a modern perspective, it sounds like a total trap, with almost no hope of escape or upward mobility.
It absolutely was. Feudalism in England was a hierarchical system of political, military, and socioeconomic organization centered on land tenure. Its primary purpose was to consolidate power and channel wealth to the king and the nobility, who then granted land to their loyal vassals in exchange for military service and loyalty. The vast majority of the population, approximately 90% of Europeans, labored on the land with severely limited opportunities for economic autonomy or political representation.
90%. Wow.
The farming land was not owned by the peasants themselves, but by the lords of the manor, and peasants worked specific strips of this land on the lord's behalf, a practice known as strip farming. Peasants were directly subject to their noble overlords, owing them substantial rents and various services. At the lowest tier of the peasant hierarchy were serfs or villeins who were legally tied to the land they worked for the local lord. They couldn't leave without the lord's permission, often a practical impossibility.
Tied to the land, literally.
Literally. Few peasants were free tenants. Customary tenure or copyhold tenure, which defined rights and duties based on ancient manorial customs, not modern legal deeds or property rights, was the norm. What's fascinating here is how the very structure of society was designed to minimize any personal gain for the vast majority. The feudal system ensured that the nobility and landowning elite prospered, while a majority of the population was kept in a state of perpetual labor.
Designed for inequality.
Fundamentally. So it wasn't just a lack of upward mobility, but an active systemic disincentive to even try to better your lot, making any modern entrepreneurial spirit or drive completely feudal a guarantee of deeper despair.
And on top of all that, they were constantly working for the Lord, often at the direct expense of their own livelihood. Even during bad harvest, the taxes and demands were still rigorously required, which is just incomprehensible to us today.
That's right. Reeves, who were essentially the Lord's estate managers, were employed by estates to ensure peasants worked as hard as possible to produce successful harvests, often to the detriment of their own fields and families.
Working against their own interests.
Exactly. A particularly resented obligation was boon work, which involved special unpaid work services for the Lord, most notably during the Lord's harvest when their own crops were ready for collection. Villains despised boon work because it directly delayed their own harvesting, often leading to the spoilage or ruin of their own vital crops.
Imagine being forced to work for someone else, knowing your own family's food supply is literally rotting in the field because of it. That's brutal.
It was deeply resented. Beyond farming their assigned strips, peasants were also expected to perform various other tasks determined by their lord, including building roads, clearing forests, hedging, threshing, thatching, and binding, all without pay.
All unpaid labor.
Correct. Furthermore, peasants were expected to provide free labor to the church when required, adding another layer of burden to their already demanding schedule. And a significant portion of their produce, approximately half their crop, had to be surrendered as rent and taxes to the lord.
Half. After all that work, half just gone.
Roughly half, yes. This raises an important question. How would a modern person, accustomed to property rights, fair wages, and the ability to control their own labor, cope with a system where half their output disappeared, and their own survival was jeopardized by mandatory unpaid labor for others? There was simply no margin for failure, no safety net, no bankruptcy protection.
So you're constantly on the edge of starvation, with no safety net, and even if you manage to produce something through sheer brutal effort, it's mostly taken from you. It's a profound disincentive to even try harder.
You've hit on the core of it. Due to increasing population pressures, even harvests that were only slightly below average meant that some people would inevitably go hungry. There was virtually no margin for error or failure in their agricultural output. Critically, stores of grain for long-term emergencies or widespread shortages were limited almost exclusively to royalty, powerful lords, wealthy merchants, and the church.
Only the rich had reserves.
Exactly. Peasants had no personal reserves to fall back on whatsoever. It's a cruel paradox that the Black Death, by drastically reducing the population, actually delivered a major blow to the feudal system. This created a severe labor shortage, which, perhaps surprisingly, led to a rise in wages as labor became more valuable, somewhat improving the bargaining position of the surviving peasants, a small, tragic silver lining.
So the plague actually helped the survivors, economically speaking.
In a grim way, yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this system actively undermined the very incentives that might drive a modern individual to overcome such immense challenges. The feudal system was fundamentally designed to extract wealth and labor for the benefit of the king and nobility. Peasants, often legally tied to the land, had virtually no economic autonomy. They were compelled to work the lord's land, pay a significant portion of their own harvest as rent and taxes, and perform extensive unpaid labor like boon work. This systematic extraction of surplus left peasants with little margin for failure, meaning any setback could lead to starvation.
One bad harvest, one illness, and you're done.
Potentially, yes. A modern person accustomed to property rights, fair wages, and legal protections against exploitation would find this level of enforced servitude and economic precarity utterly unbearable and psychologically unsustainable. It would breed a profound sense of powerlessness, anxiety, and deep hopelessness.
So we've painted a pretty bleak picture so far. A world of backbreaking labor, constant disease, and systemic oppression. But let's dig into the daily reality, the physical and psychological grind. What did an actual day look like for a medieval farmer? It sounds like it was literally dawn to dusk physical labor every single day. No weekends, no sick days, no paid holidays, just an endless, exhausting grind.
That's absolutely correct. The daily routine of medieval farmers was entirely dictated by the changing seasons and the immediate needs of their crops and livestock. Days began at dawn, often as early as 3 a.m. in the summer months when daylight allowed, and continued until sunset.
3 a.m. Ugh.
Yes, very early starts. This involved long, arduous hours of physical labor, whether in the fields or tending to animals. Tasks included the difficult demands of planting, weeding, and harvesting, as well as heavier cooperative efforts like plowing and haying. Beyond agriculture, peasants were also expected to build roads, clear forests, and perform various maintenance tasks such as hedging, threshing, thatching, and binding, essentially anything that needed doing in the manor.
And this wasn't just men out in the fields, was it? Women had equally grueling, invisible labor that was absolutely fundamental to keeping the household running, tasks we now have machines for.
That's a vital distinction and one often overlooked. Women, while often working alongside men in the fields during peak seasons like harvest, primarily performed equally physically demanding household tasks. This included grinding grain by hand, using corn stones, brewing ale, butchering animals, spinning wool into thread, doing laundry by hand, churning butter, and constantly chopping and gathering wood for fuel.
All incredibly physical work.
Immensely physical. These were not leisure activities, but fundamental for daily survival, and were entirely manual, requiring immense strength and endurance. For peasants, their work was their exercise. They perform countless tasks that are now accomplished by machines or don't need to be done at all. The travel was primarily by foot, requiring constant walking over long distances for every errand or task.
Just walking everywhere.
Everywhere. The cumulative effect of these physical demands led to chronic health problems, such as debilitating back pain, severe arthritis, and frequent injuries from accidents. What's truly striking here is the sheer volume and physical intensity of maintaining a household. For a modern person, the concept of free time or leisure was virtually non-existent, leading to chronic exhaustion, no opportunities for recuperation, and a constant mental drain.
And all that immense effort was fueled by a pretty uninspiring diet, wasn't it? Very limited, certainly not what we'd call nutritionally balanced by modern standards, leading to a constant struggle against deficiencies.
Not at all balanced, no. The medieval peasant diet was severely limited, relying heavily on staple crops like bread, porridge, and vegetables. Their two primary meals were typically porridge, similar to oatmeal, and pottage, A thick soup made from vegetables like onions, garlic, carrots, turnips, sometimes beans, and occasionally preserved meat, often enriched with lard for extra nutrients and fat.
Pottage. Sounds bland.
Likely very monotonous. This lack of dietary variety frequently led to significant nutritional deficiencies, particularly in essential vitamins and minerals. Scurvy, as we mentioned, caused by a severe vitamin C deficiency, was common due to the scarcity and unaffordability of fresh fruits for the poor. Imagine eating the same few things day in and day out for your entire life.
I've heard there's even some debate among scholars about how many calories they actually consume given their extreme physical output.
There is, and it's a fascinating debate. Some studies suggest that the early English population routinely lived at marginally adequate or outright substandard levels of nutrition, meaning they were often on the brink of starvation.
Right on the edge.
Exactly. Conversely, other scholars assert that peasants had access to a monotonous but abundant supply of foodstuffs, potentially consuming an average of 6,000 to 9,000 calories per day, especially given the heavy physical demands we've discussed.
That huge number again.
Yeah, it's a wide range. For context, a 145-pound male peasant toiling daily would require approximately 2,500 calories just to sustain basic function. Grains such as barley, wheat, oats, and rye provided essential vitamins like K, B1, B2, niacin, B6, and folic acid, along with minerals such as potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium, and fiber. Legumes like peas, lentils, beans, favas, and vetches also formed a significant component of the diet, providing much-needed protein.
So maybe they got enough calories, just not enough variety.
That could be part of it. Meat consumption varied regionally based on access to grazing lands, with cattle, swine, sheep, goats, and poultry being common, supplemented occasionally by wild game. However, iron deficiencies were particularly prevalent among early medieval women due to poor nutrition and frequent childbearing, contributing substantially to their early average age of death.
Childbearing and poor diet, a deadly combination.
Sadly, yes. This raises an important question. Even if calorie intake was high, was it efficient nutrition? The sheer monotony, coupled with constant energy expenditure, still created vulnerability to specific deficiencies. For a modern individual, the lack of sensory pleasure in food, the sheer monotony of it, would be a significant psychological drain, on top of any nutritional concerns and the constant feeling of never being truly satisfied.
And the homes themselves sound more like glorified sheds than anything we'd recognize as living spaces. No comfort, no privacy, just basic, often unsanitary shelter.
That's a good way to put it. Peasant homes were typically small, rudimentary huts, often consisting of only one or two rooms, and often shared by both people and their livestock, with approximately a third of the interior partitioned off for animals.
Living with the animals, literally.
Side by side with animal waste and animal odors. Floors were usually earthen. Ventilation was poor, and light sources were minimal. Windows, if present, were very small openings with wooden shutters, primarily for security and warmth, meaning darkness even during the day. Thatched roofs were common, but easily destroyed by storms or fire.
Leaky and flammable, great.
Not ideal, no. Many homes, especially in southern England, lacked chimneys or upper floors, leading to significant soot accumulation from the central hearth, where a fire was almost always kept burning as relighting it was an incredibly difficult task.
So smoky inside all the time.
Very smoky. Furniture was basic, consisting of a few stools, rudimentary bedding often made of straw, and essential cooking utensils. Sleeping areas were notoriously infested with bedbugs, lice, and other biting insects, ensuring little comfort or restful sleep.
Bedbugs and lice.
Not pleasant? Candles, typically made from animal oil and fat, produced a pungent and unpleasant aroma, while some improvements in housing began to emerge for wealthier peasant subclasses towards the end of the medieval period, like larger homes with 2 rooms or even a second floor. Modern materials like glass and lime cement only became widely available much later, in the mid-1500s.
Centuries later.
Centuries. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the living conditions were not just uncomfortable, they were inherently unsanitary and lacked any possibility of restorative rest. For a modern person, the constant discomfort, the lack of clean, safe personal space, and the continuous battle against vermin would add immense psychological burden to the already crushing physical challenges.
So if we look at the entire agrarian calendar, from autumn to summer, it really was a year-round, never-ending cycle of toil, wasn't it? No breaks, no real rest, just one demanding task after another, each critical for survival.
None at all. In autumn, they were plowing fields for the 3rd time, sowing winter wheat or rye, and frantically harvesting and storing crops. This involved heavy plowing, strenuous harvesting with sickles and scythes, and constant lifting and carrying. The timing was crucial. Too dry, the grain fell off. Too wet, it rotted. And of course, securing adequate storage and paying taxes and rents to the Lord loomed large.
Then winter, I imagine, was just about hunkering down and trying not to freeze or starve, with continued labor even indoors.
Exactly. Winter was focused on maintenance and repair of tools and homes, tending to animals kept indoors in the shared living space, and the physically demanding communal task of threshing grain with flails. The risks were immense. The cold itself, limited food reserves dwindling, and increased illness for both humans and livestock due to close quarters and poor nutrition.
And then spring, the cycle begins anew with renewed intensity, as though the previous season's work never ended.
Spring meant plowing fields for the first and second times, sowing spring crops like peas, beans, oats, and barley, and the continuous weeding. This involved intense plowing, manual sowing, and constant hoeing, often on hands and knees for hours. Risks included late spring frosts, damaging seeds, too much sunshine, and aggressive competition from weeds, all compounded by the Lord's demands for boon work, which could pull them away from their own vital planting.
Forced labor interfering with your own planting. Just awful.
Deeply problematic for survival. And finally, summer brought continuous weeding, heavy haying, often communally tending livestock, and preparing for, then harvesting, summer crops. It was long, brutal hours in the field, strenuous harvesting under the sun, and constant vigilance against heavy rains preventing hay curing, crop failures due to weather, livestock disease, and again, the dreaded boon work delaying their own vital harvests. This raises an important question. Where is the off switch in this cycle? There was no respite, no break from the relentless cycle of physical demands and the constant threat of failure. It was a life of unceasing, unforgiving toil. Hashtag outro.
So there you have it. This deep dive has, I hope, systematically dismantled any lingering romantic notions of medieval farming. We've explored the brutal realities of primitive agricultural practices and the sheer, backbreaking labor they demanded from every single individual, from dawn till dusk. We've delved into nature's cruel, unpredictable hand, from devastating droughts to the horrors of the Great Famine, which pushed people to unthinkable extremes. We've navigated a world teeming with pervasive and untreatable diseases, made exponentially worse by abysmal hygiene and a complete lack of medical understanding. And we've seen how the oppressive feudal system extracted every ounce of surplus, every bit of effort, leaving literally no margin for error or personal gain, and crushing any hope for true autonomy.
The cumulative effect of all these factors would be utterly, profoundly overwhelming for a modern individual. Imagine the chronic, debilitating exhaustion, the constant nutritional deficiencies, and critically, the profound psychological burden, the anxiety, perpetual scarcity, the depression of unceasing labor, and the pervasive hopelessness that comes from living with absolutely no margin for error.
That phrase really sticks with you. No margin for error.
It defines the experience. For someone accustomed to the safety nets we have today, to predictability, and to a degree of control over their destiny, this would be profoundly unsustainable. Survival in medieval England wasn't merely a physical challenge. It was a profound and continuous psychological ordeal that would likely break the spirit and resolve of most modern individuals within a matter of days or weeks. It was a life of unceasing toil, constant threat, and minimal reward, where every single day was a battle for sheer existence, a true impossible harvest. Given everything we've uncovered today about the unrelenting challenges, the sheer impossibility, if you had to choose just one modern comfort or technological advancement to bring back with you to medieval England to maximize your chances of survival, what would it be and why?
That's a truly chilling thought, isn't it? To face that level of daily battle with no reprieve. It really makes you appreciate the world we live in now, however imperfect. What stands out to YUU from our deep dive today? Think about that for a while. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into another fascinating topic.